I have shared with you all before the story of how Sharon and I met at a date auction. If you haven't heard that story, that is a story for another time that I would love to share. But one of the things that I wanted to share about when Sharon and I met was that when Sharon and I first met, her first impression of me is that she was fairly confident that this was not going anywhere. That there was nothing that was going to happen between us, that there was nothing serious here. And in fact, there were a couple of occasions where later I found out she considered letting me know. Like, hey, by the way, just so you know, I just see us as friends. And I told her my response, if she had said that, would have been, yeah, me too. That is really arrogant of you. But as we spent more time together, as we started to get to know one another, her first impression of me started to change. Certain things that Sharon could only know about me by getting to know me, by spending time with me. There were things that Sharon could only know about me by me telling her those things about me. And so over time, that first impression that was based purely on observation changed as she came to know the truth of me. For Sharon to know that, for example, I was not content with just her knowing that I existed. I wasn't content for her to just know of me. I wanted her to want to know more about me. I wanted her to get to know me by spending time with me. This story this morning with Pilate and Jesus, Pilate ends this encounter with Jesus with this critical question, a question that even he doesn't fully grasp the weight of, which is, what is truth? And that's what I want us to spend time with this morning, is this question of what is truth, and especially what is truth with respect to God. My own journey with this question began because I wanted to know, how do we know that what we believe about God is true? How do we know truth? And it was a pretty windy journey, as I think it is for all of us. But there was something that was really critical for me in this process that I want to share with you this morning. It was a thought from Albert Einstein, of all people. He says this: the investigator who wishes to acquire a knowledge of the truth must not set to work with a preconceived notion of what he will find. He must adapt his methods of investigation to the object, not the object to his method. In other words, what Einstein was getting at is that our method of investigation must take into account the thing that we are working to investigate. Our approach to knowing a person, for example, is different than investigating an organism in a petri dish. The approach is going to be different. And just as it was with Sharon and I, if I had some control over what Sharon knew about me, because there were certain things she could only know if I told her, how much more is God in control of what we know of him? Where am I going with this? Where I'm headed with this is that our disposition matters. Our disposition to seeking truth matters. Imagine for a second if Sharon came to me and said, look, I want to investigate you. I want to find out things about you, find out if you are dateable material, but I'm not interested in spending any time with you. I'm not interested in talking to you. And until I've made some decisions about your acceptability, I don't really want to hang out with you. I would have been like, that's not how this works. You've got to spend time with me. You've got to have conversation with me. And as much as we want to study God like we study any other object of investigation, the truth is God is not an object. There are certain things that we can only know about God if God chooses to tell us. This may be a bold statement, and I've shared this with some of you, but I believe that if we approach God like I just described Sharon approaching me, I firmly believe that God has such control over our knowledge of him that he can hide himself from us, even making it possible to explain all of creation without him. Because God isn't interested in a forced acknowledgement of his existence. God is not insecure. He isn't interested in us just saying, okay, God, I give up, you exist. He wants you to know the truth of him in the context of a loving relationship with you. And so we can only have that when we pursue him in genuine interest and in humility. But before we get ahead of ourselves, I want to come back to Pilate's question of what is truth. There's a lot of thoughts about what truth is. I got a couple of quotes to represent a couple of those perspectives. One of them comes from the 16th century Japanese author and philosopher Miyamoto Musashi. He writes this: "Truth is not what you want it to be. It is what is, and you must bend to its power or live a lie." Another definition or another perspective on truth comes from the 19th century French novelist Gustave Flaubert. And he writes this: "There is no truth. There is only perception." I think most of us, if we are honest, really like the idea of truth when we believe it's on our side. We're a big champion of truth when we believe it is on our side. It backs our perspective up. However, we are less enthralled with the idea when it's more convenient for things to be a little murky, a little cloudy, a little unclear. Right now, I believe we live in a truth-starved world. A world where we are much more interested in bending the truth to conform to our lives than bending our lives to conform to the truth. This is where I believe the great 20th century philosopher, the king of rock and roll from Graceland, Elvis Presley, got it right. He said, "Truth is like the sun. You can shut it out for a time, but it ain't going away." Whether we believe in absolute truth or believe that it's obstructed by the limitations of our perception, or maybe we don't believe absolute truth exists at all, I still believe there are some times where we come face to face with the question of what is true. And oftentimes these are moments of pain where we just want to know the truth. For example, is it really true that this relationship is over? Is it really true that we're not getting back together? Or maybe it's the loss of a loved one when we think, is it really true that they're really gone? Are they really no longer with us? There are innumerable circumstances that bring us to this place where all of the theory moves aside and we just want to know what's true. Truth may be difficult to ascertain, and it may even be harder to accept and change because of it, but the words of Elvis are true. It ain't going away. And so we can entertain ourselves and distract ourselves, but at some point reality brings us back to Pilate's question: what is truth? And so that's what I want us to spend some time on this morning, is answering the question, what is truth? And then how do we respond to it? This morning I want to give you three things that this passage tells us about what truth is. And then I want to look at three responses to truth that we see in this passage. And then I want to close with three things that I'm going to ask you to do. 3 sets of 3. How much more preachy does it get than that? So picking up the story in verse 28, it says, "Then they led Jesus from Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters." So Jesus has just been arrested in the garden. He has been to the house of the high priest, and now they are bringing them to the Roman governor's headquarters. It was early morning. They did not enter the headquarters themselves, otherwise they would be defiled and unable to eat the Passover. Now, I have to tell you, this part makes me scratch my head a little bit, because here they are bringing an innocent man to be condemned to die, but they're concerned about walking into the headquarters and being defiled and not being able to take the Passover. Some priorities seem a little off here. So Pilate came out to them and said, "What charge do you bring against this man?" They answered him, "If this man weren't a criminal, we wouldn't have handed him over to you." The first thing that we see in this passage about truth is that truth is about right knowledge. The right knowledge of this situation knows that Jesus is innocent. Truth undoubtedly carries this element of knowledge, of information. And so when we think of truth, one of the things that we think of is how fully does it conform to reality? A truth of history is something that is true depending on how well it conforms to what actually happened. I know many, if not all of us, have heard the story of George Washington cutting down the cherry tree, right? We heard it in elementary school. The story goes, George Washington, as a 6-year-old boy, got a new hatchet, and he wants to try this thing out, and so he cuts down his father's favorite cherry tree. Well, his father finds out, and he becomes incredibly angry with George Washington. And in this iconic moment, George Washington, 6 years old, says, "I cannot tell a lie. I cut it down." And his father's response to this is that his father embraced him and declares to his son that his honesty is worth more to him than 1,000 trees. And so it's this great story of honesty, but unfortunately, it did not happen. It was something that was created by an early biographer of George Washington, but it does not conform to what actually happened. What corresponds to the reality of Jesus' action is that he had not broken the law of God. Only their man-made interpretations of it. Things like he couldn't heal on the Sabbath. That he claimed to be the Son of God, which is only a problem if it isn't true. And so we see in this passage the way that they skirt the truth, saying, we wouldn't have brought him to you if you weren't a criminal. Reminds me of a story when I was in middle school. My brother and I would often get home before my parents. And so occasionally we would get into it with one another, as you do. And I remember one day my mom came home and I went to her and told her this story of what my brother Ben had done to me. This egregious thing he had done, this outrageous thing he had done. And my mom's response to that is that exactly how it happened? Is that really how it happened? And my response to her was basically, I wouldn't be telling you if it wasn't how it happened, right? Like I was distracting from her question with my own question. Because I knew deep down it wasn't exactly that black and white. It was probably a little murkier than that. The Jewish leaders here were distracting from Pilate's question with a question because they knew that the truth was not on their side. Verse 31, Pilate told them, "You take him and judge him according to your law." "It's not legal for us to put anyone to death," the Jews declared. They said this so that Jesus' words might be fulfilled, indicating what kind of death he was going to die. The second thing that we see in this passage about truth is that truth is about right action. That it's not just about right knowledge, but it's also about living in accordance with that knowledge. In this story, what we see is that they are bringing Jesus to them because they want a certain outcome. They want the outcome of Jesus being killed, and they can't do that under their law. And so what we see in this moment is that they're not concerned about justice. What they're concerned about is maintaining power, maintaining their position of power. And so what can happen for us is that we can hold the right things to be true, but then deny that truth with our action. We can undermine the credibility of that truth through our lives. John has spoken of this earlier in chapter 3. He said, "For everyone who does evil hates the light and avoids it, so that his deeds may not be exposed. But anyone who lives by the truth comes to the light, so that his works may be shown to be accomplished by God." That truth somehow is connected to a way of life. That it's not just about knowledge and disembodied information. An example of this in our own American history are the example of preachers and evangelists in the early American South. Jamar Tisby talks about this in his book, Color of Compromise. And he talks about how these preachers and evangelists would come to plantations in the South and ask to preach the gospel to the enslaved people. And they were allowed to do this under the condition that when they preached this message of Jesus' liberation for them, that when enslaved people chose to be baptized, they confessed in their baptism that this liberation was purely spiritual, that it was not a physical liberation from their slavery and their bondage. And so the truth of this message that Jesus brings liberation was undermined by their action. It was questioned. Verse 33, then Pilate went back to the headquarters, summoned Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Are you asking this on your own, or have others told you about me?" "I'm not a Jew, am I?" Pilate replied. "Your own nation and the chief priests have handed you over to me. What have you done?" "My kingdom is not of this world," said Jesus. "If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight, so that I wouldn't be handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here." "You are a king then?" Pilate asked. "You say that I'm a king." Jesus replied, "I was born for this, and I've come into the world for this, to testify to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice." The third thing that we see about truth in this passage and that we see throughout the Gospel of John is that truth is ultimately a person. Truth is ultimately embodied in Jesus. Last week, Abby taught on John 14:6 that talks about Jesus claimed to be the way, the truth, and the life. And she talked about how Jesus didn't say that he was a way or a truth, but he was the truth. What truth is Jesus? Well, on the one hand, Jesus is the truth about God. He is the embodiment of God in human flesh. And so if we want to know the truth of who God is, we can look at Jesus. The gospel accounts of Jesus that put on display his character, his heart, his power, his goodness. But at the same time, given that Jesus was both fully God and fully man, Jesus is also the truth of the kinds of humans you and I were created to be when we were created in the image of God. That he demonstrates for us how we were created to be, who we were created to be as humans. And so he is the truth of God, but also the truth of humanity. I want to move to three responses to truth that we see in this passage. The first that we see comes in verse 38. "What is truth?" said Pilate. After he had said this, he went out to the Jews again and told them, "I find no grounds for charging him." Pilate's question in this moment, the way that he asked it, is almost sarcastic. He kind of scoffs at it. He says, "What is truth?" And he walks out the door, not genuinely interested in Jesus' answer to this question. And so you get the sense that for Pilate, this first response to truth is that truth is irrelevant. For Pilate, what really matters is power. He walks out thinking, "Jesus, you can talk about truth all day long, but I'm the one who has the power to end your life. That's what really matters." And I'm wondering this morning, if you're really honest with yourself, is truth irrelevant? If you're really honest with yourself, you would say what really matters is being significant. What really matters is being successful. What really matters is having a lot of followers. What really matters is making a lot of money. What really matters is what gets me ahead in life. We might also think, what really matters is what keeps my party in power, or what will get my party in power. Maybe you know on an intellectual level that truth isn't irrelevant, but the way of your life would say otherwise, that our priorities, the way that we spend our time, our finances, the relationships that we get caught up in, our lives would say something else is what we would say really matters. We see the second response. It says, after he had said this, he went out to the Jews again and told them, "I find no grounds for charging him. You have a custom that I release one prisoner to you at the Passover. So do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews?" They shouted back, "Not this man, but Barabbas." Now Barabbas was a revolutionary. Pilate seems a little bit confused about what's going on here, because he goes out to them kind of trying to offer a way to let Jesus off the hook. To say, "Look, I usually allow the release of one prisoner. Do you want me to release Jesus back to you?" And their response to this is, "No, not Jesus. Give us Barabbas." And the irony here is absurd. Because if they were really concerned about insurrection, if these Jewish leaders were really concerned about somebody starting a revolution against the Roman government, they wouldn't want Barabbas set free. Right? Like, you're beginning to see the sham that this is. And so for these Jewish leaders, their response to truth is that truth is inconvenient. Barabbas is the true insurrectionist. And the truth that Jesus isn't a revolutionary in the way they present him is inconvenient information. I'm wondering for you this morning, is the truth just inconvenient for you? Is the truth about Jesus inconvenient for a relationship that you've got with a boyfriend or a girlfriend? Is it inconvenient for acting ethically at work? Is the truth inconvenient? And then finally, we see a third response, verse 37. Jesus has just talked about his kingdom and says, "You are a king then," Pilate asked. "You say that I'm a king," Jesus replied. "I was born for this, and I have come into the world for this, to testify to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice." Jesus identifies this other crowd, this other group of people who are the people who listen to his voice. And the third response is their response to Jesus' voice. When Jesus talks about this group of people who listen to his voice, it takes us back to John 10, where Jesus has talked about himself as the good shepherd, and that his sheep follow him because they know his voice. What we're going to see with this group of people is that the truth is inescapable. The truth is unavoidable. It's inevitable. These are the ones who listen to his voice, who have accepted his kingship and accepted that his kingdom is not of this world, but it is an inevitable kingdom. And I want to close by mentioning three things that those who listen to his voice will do. Three things that I'm going to ask you to do. The first thing is, when it comes to truth, I'm going to ask you to put truth above your reactions. Will you put truth above your reactions? Sometimes when we hear things, our immediate reaction to that is so strong. We're so emotional. And so we think, if I feel this strongly about it, it must be true. But just because we react strongly to it doesn't mean it isn't true. Some of the things in the world that we react to strongest because they're true. It's just a hard truth to accept. The second thing that those who listen to his voice do is that they put truth above your desires. Will you put truth above your desires? Just because you don't want it to be true doesn't mean it isn't true. And then finally, the third thing is to put truth above your pride. Will you put truth above your pride? Just because it hurts to admit that it's true doesn't mean it's not true. One of the hardest things for us as humans to do is to accept that maybe we've got something else to learn, that there's more to the story. but those who listen to his voice put truth above pride. I want to ask you this morning, are you ready to accept the truth of who Jesus is and to live in accordance with this truth? This is the response that recognizes that Jesus is the king he says he is. The king whose kingdom is not of this world, but whose kingdom is inevitable. Are you ready to lay aside your pride, to acknowledge that maybe you've been pursuing God and knowledge of God, standing over God, saying, God, I'll believe in you if you just prove yourself to me. And you're being invited today instead to kneel and to acknowledge that God's in control of what we know of him. We need to change our posture to receive the truth of him, to accept the truth that he wants a loving relationship with you. And he wants to begin that today. We're going to have our prayer team come forward if you would like for somebody to pray with you, but I want to invite you to just bow your heads as we come and meet King Jesus in this moment. God, we come this morning recognizing that maybe we have approached you with arrogance. We have approached you believing we already know the truth. And what we're seeing this morning is, God, we have misunderstood your heart. God, that we've allowed our emotions to tell us what's true. We've allowed our desires to tell us what's true, our pride to tell us what's true. But today we need to come and lay that down and receive the truth of who you are. If that's you this morning, I want to invite you to just pray this with me. Jesus, I confess that I have sought you in all the wrong ways. I acknowledge now that you love me. I want to believe. Help me believe. Jesus, I invite you to come and meet us here this morning, to encounter us as the truth. Come and meet us in this place.